Hello and welcome to the Mysticast, where you join Jack Stafford and Deborah Littleboy, members of the Aetherius Society, the cosmic religion for the Aquarian Age, as we break down the barriers between religion, science, metaphysics, philosophy, and mysticism, all of which are really only aspects of the self-same quest for truth. Please note, this is an independent program, not produced or fact-checked by the Aetherius Society. Today, our guest is the writer Graham Phillips. Hello, Graham.
Hello. Pleased to be on your show.
It's wonderful to have you. We also have a special returning guest, Anne Baring. Hello, Anne.
Hello.
Because today we're going to want to talk about the essential role for women in our world today and in the future. And this is something you've written extensively about. Am I right, Graham?
Well, the book that I've just written concerns a group of Victorian women, rich women in Victorian period, who decided that they wanted to change the lot for women throughout the world, because till the mid-1800s, women virtually had no right anywhere ever. And these women wanted to try and change it. And the way they did it was extraordinary. They started a mystical order, a group, and they used what we could only describe as occultism, mysticism, magic to do this. And my book, Strange Fate, is all about that.
How did you hear about this group then?
Well, there's a place in North Staffordshire in central England called Bidol Grange. It's a Victorian mansion. And in 1851, this group started, and it included some quite famous women. One of them became a leading feminist, a woman called Barbara Bodichon. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. She started the world's first regular feminist magazine and the first permanent feminist group in London. She was a member of the group. There were other people later that were members of the group that were famous pre-Raphaelite painters, such as there was Jane Morris, the husband of William Morris, the wallpaper designer, him and famous pre-Raphaelite painter. And there was some occultists who were very famous, like the Golden Dawn leader, Florence Farr. And so all these people, some of them came from London, some of them were from northern Staffordshire, but they met at Bidol Grange. And astonishingly, the lady who pretty much ran, the wife of the man who owned Bidol Grange, he was traveling the world doing other business things. And she pretty much ran the estate on her own. He just left her to do it. And she built these amazing temples in the gardens and the estate around Bidol. There was an Egyptian recreation of an Egyptian tomb, an underground recreation of a Roman temple, a Chinese shrine, and an ancient Celtic glen. And so they had these different types of shrines built there. Everyone kind of thought, well, they're just building them like as follies, as something just for decorative purposes. But the writings that we found that survived at Bidol Grange talk about them getting up to all sorts of mystical activities. They were trying to use different forms of ancient magic, like from Egypt and from Egypt and China and Tibet and so on. And it was all for, they hoped that they wanted to try and bring about feminism. And some of them came feminist activists, like the lady I mentioned who started the first magazine. But they thought that if we're ever going to get changes through, how on earth are we going to get the men who are in government to vote these things through? That's the most important question. And somehow they believe that only by doing this these mystical activities could they achieve this. And what happened was that when you look at the history of it, it's incredible. Over the next few years, women suddenly got the right to own property. They'd never had that before, to inherit property, to run their own businesses, and many other things like this. And these are all being voted through by men, but not just in Great Britain, and also in America, in Australia, elsewhere in the British Empire, but also in places like China and Japan. Japan stayed pretty backward as far as allowing women to do anything other than just be housewives, if you like, and look pretty for many, many years. But there was a period in the mid to late 1800s where they made tremendous advances. And this was happening all over the world, even in Russia, places like this. And there's no explanation why men in charge of things all over the world should suddenly start saying, well, let's start giving women these rights. It wasn't like in the First World War, when women were so involved in producing armaments and working in the service industries when all the men were off fighting, that eventually allowed them to gain the vote in many places. There was nothing like that putting pressure on these men to grant women all these rights. But the only thing I can think about is that the people that met at Bidol Grange, who called themselves the Order of Nehemiah, were in fact successful in their mystical activity.
What do you think about that, Anne? Does that resonate with you?
I think that's fascinating. I knew about a woman in America whom Harriet something Howe, her name was, who'd made an extraordinary proclamation in the mid-19th century. But I didn't know about this group of women. Interestingly enough, I lived in Shropshire near Bidol Grange with my parents for many years, from about 1948 to 1960, more or less. So
wow.
I know the area, and my mother would have been so interested in this if only she'd known about it, because she was a real advanced thinker in this way. And so what you just said was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. When is this book coming out, or is it already been published?
It came out earlier in the year, but it's there. It can be got on Amazon now. Anyway, I'm published by Inner Traditions in America, but this book, myself and my co-author Jody decided to publish it ourselves to get it out quickly.
No, through Amazon.
A couple of years when so we've done it through Amazon, and it's out already.
Very good, fantastic. Anyway, good work, because it lays the foundation. And also, I wonder if they were connected with Blavatsky and Annie Besant.
They were connected with her. Florence Farr certainly was.
Yeah,
she was one of the main leaders of the group.
Yes, because that would have been the connection with Tibet through Blavatsky.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah,
interesting. Very, very, very.
They started in 1851 before the Theosophical Society. They were before the Golden Dawn, the Theosophical Society, Amorc. They were the first kind of occult revival group anywhere, as far as I know.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. But thank you so much for writing this book. I think it's wonderful, and it will help women to understand that this isn't something new; that it's something that's been going on for 150 years, sort of thing. So
some people have said, well, I mean, surely they couldn't really do this. But while I was investigating it, Jody and I were investigating this, it was absolutely incredible, because we started we heard many accounts of people saying over the years that they'd seen what could only be described as not so much ghosts, but visions into the past. Yeah. People had been in the area and going around these shrines or temples in the gardens. I mean, it's open to the public now. But people going around were saying, oh, are you having some sort of Victorian special afternoon? We saw some ladies dressed in Victorian clothes down by the Chinese garden. Really? And they say, no, you've seen the ghosts. But they don't seem to be ghosts so much. I mean, we actually caught one of these on film. Myself, Jody was filming me going into the Egyptian tomb temple thing down this dark corridor. And suddenly we both felt there was somebody standing next to me. And Jody had this dream a few weeks before in which she's seen me walking down this corridor and seen a lady dressed in Victorian clothes, white shirt and hair up in a bun, standing next to me and turning to look at me. And she was suddenly reminded of this. And she said, that's incredible. That's what I saw in the dream. You were wearing the same clothes you should wear now. So I was having a premonition, but how am I seeing a Victorian lady? When the film was developed, when we looked at the film, the digital filming from our camera that she'd done, you can see quite clearly there's a white figure that sort of turns and looks at me as I go past. Really? Now, I've got that up on my if anybody wants to see that, on my YouTube channel, which is Graham Phillips Author. You can have a look at the videos about Bidol Grange and see that. There's one called How It All Began, I think, and it's on that video. You can see it. I mean, there's definitely somebody there turning. So Jody seemed to have had a vision into the future of what I'd be doing and when this lady would appear. But this lady seems to have been from the past. it's almost as if it's not so much ghosts there, but time slips that are going on.
Yeah, well,
So
I
there's
think
definitely something weird at that
I think
place.
there in the other world there is no time in our sense. So you probably have consecutive times all folding together, as it were, or
That's right. That's what we
merging
thought.
with each other. So I think
Yes.
that's probably what happened in your case. But it's very, very interesting and fascinating. That should have been an Egyptian one, where the mysteries first started, which they must have known about, and alchemy first started in Egypt. So very, very interesting, opening up this window into not really the past, but the contemporary present, if you like, or the adjacent present.
Well, we even had some weird universe shifts. I mean, it's the only thing I can describe. Jodie and I, when we first went to Bidol Grange, had done a lot of research, and we knew that the place had burned down in a fire in 1897. And we'd done a lot of research into it. We knew when the year was and what happened and so on and so forth. And when we were actually looking around Bidol Grange, and they've got photographs up on the wall in one room, and there's a plaque saying this was the firefighters that put out the fire in 1897 standing before the smouldering house. It was rebuilt afterwards. We then went to, there was nearby, there was a stone circle and an old tomb that's probably megalithic, dates back thousands, a good 3,000 years. And some of the stones were moved from there because it's actually on the estate. The owner of the estate, a man called James Bateman in the 1850s, had moved the stones from this stone circle into his grounds, and they're now surrounding the Chinese and Celtic gardens there, the shrines. And he had every right to do this. It was on his land, and he felt he was protecting them because local people were smashing them up and stuff like this. Now, when we went to this old tomb, which seems to be where the whole Me and I group first started doing their stuff, I won't go into all that now. It's quite a long story. But we went there, and the moment we arrived, it was a lovely sunny day. Suddenly, this cloud came over the trees up next to us. We thought, how on earth, we didn't notice this cloud before. It completely, the skies opened, the rain poured down in torrents. There was thunder, lightning. And at one point, when we were filming it, there was this light, like a ball lightning thing right across in front of the camera. And all this suddenly happened for about 5 minutes. And then the rain stopped. The cloud just seemed to dissipate. It didn't blow off anywhere. And we thought, wow, it was almost as if something was meant to happen to us. When we went back to Bidol Grange, we were looking at this picture again of the Bidol Grange after the fire with the firefighters at the front. And Jodie said, hold on, it says 1896. It was 1897 before. And suddenly everybody said, no, always been 1896. And this was just the first of a load of seemingly universe changes that seemed to happen. I can't explain that. I'm still in the wrong universe because it's still 1896. So this place definitely had something weird about it.
Yeah. How fascinating. All this is very, very interesting to me too, because my mother was quite psychic, so she would have been in touch with things like you are, and you are recording and telling us. And strangely enough, there's a man called William Bidolph who went to Australia to learn how to make wine, and my daughter knew him. And he was he even left his wine in our wine cellar for a while. So there's a connection here going on underneath what you've been saying and what I shall say. But what do you think is the role of women now? How do you see us doing what they did then in this time and space?
Well, it's the thing that these women were able to do this, because the weird thing about it, it's almost as if it was fated to happen or something was actually working to make this come about. All these women were extraordinarily rich, but most of them didn't start off rich. Jane Morris, for a start, she was the leader of the group around 1900. Jane Morris, and she lived for a long time, she lived quite close to Bidol Grange, in a town called Leek. Jane Morris started off as a serving girl. She worked in service in a stately home somewhere in Oxfordshire. And she met the painter Rossetti and another painter, Edward Burne-Jones, who decided, because of the way she looked, she was the pre-Raphaelite ideal of beauty. So they wanted for her to model. She modeled. She became quite famous. She modeled for a lot of these. In fact, a lot of the pre-Raphaelite paintings you see are of Jane Morris. She was
that glorious red hair. That glorious
red hair. Yeah, all of that. That's her. Now, what happened is that she eventually married William Morris, who is one of the pre-Raphaelite people, one of the designers and painters of the pre-Raphaelite period. She married him. Now, this is a girl who hadn't been educated and who was a serving girl. She educated herself. It seemed that William Morris, he wasn't really that interested in, he let her do exactly what she wanted to do, and he went off and did his own thing, which is what all these women's husbands did. They kind of all went off and did something else and said, get on with it, here's all the money.
Yeah.
And she educated herself. She ended up speaking 5 languages. She became an accomplished pianist. She had elocution lessons, changed her language, changed the way she spoke. Eventually, she was able to pass in aristocratic society as one of them. And when George Bernard Shaw met her, he based his character of Eliza Doolittle in Pygmalion, My Fair Lady, on Jane Morris. She was the real Eliza Doolittle. Yeah. She was an astonishing woman, and eventually she became a painter in her own right. Most of the stuff that's attributed to William Morris tapestry or William Morris wallpaper, was designed by Jane. But they had to agree that his name was used, or the clients wouldn't let all know happening by a woman.
Yeah.
So, but that's just one example. All of the women involved in the group were somehow in a position to be married to very wealthy people, whether they were painters, industrialists, aristocrats, or whatever. But all their husbands had gone off around the world and said, just get on with it. And so they were in a unique position to have the time and the money, and they were all hyper intelligent to be able to do this. Now, whether something like this would happen today, it's all very different today. Everything's social media, it's not about having vast amounts of money so much. So
no, it's about connecting people, connecting women all over the world with each other. That's very, very important, connecting women all over the world with each other and knowing what they're doing. I gave a talk 2 days ago with a group which will go on Australian TV. Extraordinary women, whom I'd never heard of, 2 from the indigenous cultures, who are very advanced, the indigenous women, in knowing exactly what's needed. And we all spoke about the need to end war, that war is an addiction, which men can't break on their own. They need women's help to break it, to make them conscious that it is an addiction. And then they have to work, like with alcoholics or drug addicts, to free men from this terrible attraction to creating more and more weapons and more war where they can use the weapons and test them out, so to speak, and using up colossal sums of money, our money, on things which kill people. You know, it's absolutely unbelievable, outrageous, ridiculous, insane. It is insane.
I totally agree.
The question is, how do you stop it?
So I don't know. I mean, there's all these wars going on now. We're in a mess, this world is. We need to be concentrating on alternative forms of energy and all sorts of other things. And vast amounts of money are being applied into these wars. Exactly. And when they stop one war, they start another one.
Well, they want to do that. They want to keep it going because that's money. That's where the money is. So if you what's called follow the money, you find out who's doing what behind the scenes. And it's mainly America, who is obsessed with power, Russia, equally obsessed with power, and China coming up to the 3rd position, so to speak. So between the 3 of them, plus North Korea, they're manufacturing colossal numbers of weapons aimed to kill people, which is a demonic activity. And this is really what the messages from my mother were saying, that we have to stop the killing, because this is going to ultimately not only destroy our species, but it will possibly destroy the whole planet through our stupidity and our hubris. We think we know it all, and we don't. We don't know the powers that are behind the scenes, which these women would have known about, the occult powers, and they would have asked for the blessing of the occult powers in order to counteract the negative occult powers. They would have known all about that. And perhaps we women nowadays need to know about that as well. And certainly with this group I was talking with on Wednesday, they're all aware of what we're confronting in the way of evil, and that we really call upon the Divine Mother, which that book is mentioning quite often, to really inspire us and direct us to the path in which we can have some effective impact on the male psyche. It's not to make a male an enemy of the male, but to help him come out of his addiction. And this is a very big, deep problem. I mean, we know how difficult it is to get people who are alcoholics or drug addicts off their addiction, and how they kill themselves if they don't come off it. So we're faced with the same situation of being destroyed by the male addiction if we don't do something to stop it.
One of the things that I found fascinating about this Mia group, it started in 1851, and a lot of groups in the past had always been started by some bearded old man, you know. But the group, when the beginnings of it was started by a 7-year-old girl. She didn't actually organize the group, but it was her kind of visions and things. What happened was that at this place called the Bridestones, this place where Jodie and I went in with this storm, they were excavating that. The man who owned the place, James Bateman, his cousin was an archaeologist, and he was excavating this mound, and inside the mound there was this chamber, tomb. Now just the actual stone chamber remains. And he was excavating it, and his friend and business partner, a man called Robert Heath, who eventually owned the property of the Grange, his little daughter, Mary, who was 7 years old, kind of like was playing around, and she crawled in to this little opening that they'd made in this tomb, and was the first one inside. And they were going, "No, Mary, no, come back, come back." She went in there, and she came out different. She came out, said she'd found this small stone heart in there, which they eventually believed had some kind of strange properties. But the main thing is she started to be psychic and tell people things that they couldn't have known. A lot of people say, no, there's some trick here. Until she told them that on the southern part of the estate, if they went there and dug in a certain part of this old ruined chapel was there, an old Templar chapel, they would find an underground crypt, and inside it, Templar graves. And they found them. They were just as she said. And these Templar gravestones are still on display all around the local parish church in Bidol. So, and then she came up with the ideas of what they should do. Maria Bateman, the woman who owned the property, whose husband owned the property, and she ran it all. She became the leader with Barbara Bodichon as the sort of second in charge. But all the information that start off with what they were doing and how to do it and how to build these temples was coming from a 7-year-old girl. So whatever was behind all this and decided to start it going, then it chose this little girl, the opposite of what you'd imagine, like some bearded sort of tough guy or something, you know? I thought that.
Well, there may be a Templar connection if she found Templar tombs there, because the Templars, the leading spirit of the Templars was Sophia, or divine wisdom. They had to keep it secret. They concealed it within a code, so to speak. But that was what was really guiding them to try and change the whole ideology of Europe at that time, but to honor the feminine and to bring about a revolution in the emphasis on the warrior again. But they were different sort of warriors. They were spiritual warriors, if you like. And so there may have been a connection there, possibly behind the women, a group of men inspiring to go forward in the path that they'd chosen, or that had found them, rather, and through this little girl. And children, before they go to school and become indoctrinated in our way of thinking, they're often psychic, often have psychic experiences, which their parents might dismiss as being, silly nonsense. But if we listen to them more, we might learn a lot. So that's all very interesting.
Well, the little girl, about 3 months after she actually went into this tomb, with her father, Robert Heath, and her mother, she went to stay with Lord Halifax, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, but he lived in this massive, great mansion up in Yorkshire. And while she was staying there, she went with her father wanted to sort out mining rights on the Halifax estate. So they stayed there for a couple of months over the summer. While she was there, the tutor to the children of Lord Halifax was none other than Lewis Carroll, or Charles Dodgson.
Yeah.
And he met Mary, and this gave him the first idea of Alice in Wonderland, a little girl crawling into a rabbit hole and finding, because she claimed that she sort of saw some weird, wonderful world inside this tomb when nobody else did. And while she was staying at this place, she became fascinated by a mirror that hung on the wall, and she said she could see another world in it. This gave him his original ideas for the Alice in Wonderland stories. It was years later when he eventually wrote them, and he named the character after the daughter of his, the dean of his college where he worked years later at Oxford, Alice Liddell, and he dedicated the book to her. But the person that first gave him the idea was little Mary Heath. And what's fascinating is he actually makes allusions to Mary Heath in the beginning of the Alice in Wonderland story, where the white rabbit keeps calling Alice Mary Ann, and there's no explanation why he does this, and it's no character call that appears in the story. Mary Heath's name was Mary Ann Heath, Anne after her mother. So it's fascinating that this girl was so interesting that she even inspired the story of Alice in Wonderland.
But what also interests me is what your connection is. What is, perhaps in another life, what has led you to this story, to uncover it and bring it out to this world that you're in now? I think
Mary
that's
Heath
very
is my
interesting.
great-great-grandmother.
Your great-grandmother?
Great-great-grandmother, I think it is.
Was
Mary
she
Heath, a little girl, when she grew up, she married a man, a surgeon by the name of Joseph Heffernan. And Joseph Heffernan, we discovered my father was adopted. We had genealogists do a family tree of his family. And cutting a long story short, Heffernan after Mary died, Heffernan had a child that he brought up on his own under his name, not the Heath name, obviously. And it was Mary's daughter's son's son is my dad. There you go. I'm the hopeless.
So there is a connection. Yes, how interesting.
So there is a connection. That's why I got interested in the first place.
Yeah, and also to ferret out all this information, which is quite complicated, as Heffernan is not the name that was connected to Mary Ann, so to speak.
No, I mean, luckily we had this. She didn't change her name when she married, which is interesting. She's buried under the name Mary Ann Heath in this tomb in the local church of Bidol. But it says on the wall she is married to Joseph James Heffernan, who is a surgeon in the British Army. But it doesn't actually never changed their name. So, and a lot of these women who got married, who were parts of this group, me and I group, kept a lot of them kept their maiden name.
The maiden name. Well, they would do, because they wanted to be known for what they were doing, really. Yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting story. But to get back to what we're supposed to be doing now, what are your suggestions for a woman like myself, say? How do we organize? Even with the internet, it's quite difficult to gather a huge group of women, many thousands or even millions. Have you got any suggestions?
Well, Jodie is the one, my co-author. She's the one that does all the mystical psychic stuff. She's worked out a system which she calls remote, which is like remote viewing. She can actually do this thing that I can't do, where she goes off into a kind of meditation thing where she can actually see herself in other places. And sometimes she's been able to influence people to do things. Not a lot, not massively, but I said to her, I said, God, if only more women could get together and do this kind of thing. I don't know. Everything that we know is in the book. So we're kind of hoping that the book will be read by people, and that will give them inspiration. I mean, we were inspired to do what we did. We went places and things happened just as we got there, and there were loads of weird coincidences. I mean, like, for example...
So you paid attention. You really sat up.
We paid attention to these synchronicities that took place. Like, for example, one time we went to the Bridestones, its tomb. We didn't know about the Alice in Wonderland connection, for example. And when we got there, there was like a little offerings bowl that people put things in, like beads and little ribbons and stuff when they go to this place, like sort of New Age people and so on. There was only one thing on it one time we went there, and it's a Queen of Hearts. And Jodie said, I'm sure that Queen of Hearts means something. Well, Queen of Hearts in the Alice in Wonderland story and all this. And these little things that we started to take notice of that guided us eventually. Eventually, we found this stone that they had, which they call the Heart of the Rose, which was this little pink heart-shaped stone that Mary had found in this tomb, which had been hidden, and they'd left a whole series of paintings that had been painted by Jane Morris and other people to clues as to where this was for some future generation to find. And Jodie and I found it after following not only the clues in the paintings, but these synchronicities. So if it can happen to us, and I think our purpose was to write the book so that people can read the book so they get the general idea of what to notice, rather than for Jodie and I to say, try this or do that. I mean, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that anyway, or suggesting people did. I mean, I've got no idea what people should do. I just know that we were guided along. People could read the book. People could generally become aware of synchronicities, guiding things that happen, and see what happens there is all I could suggest.
The rose is one of the oldest symbols of the goddess, and also of the Holy Spirit, the divine spirit, and feminine form of the divine spirit. So that's interesting in itself, that the shape of the stone was in a heart shape. And you mentioned something else which also triggered the idea of the feminine archetype, if you like. So,
well, the Bridestones means the stones of Brigitte, or bride, who was the main goddess of the Celts. The Briganti tribe were named after her. She became known as Saint Bridget in Ireland, eventually when it was all Christianized. And all these shrines at the Bidol Grange, they're all basically sacred to generally female deities, or not so much deities, but kind of demigods, not even demi-spirits. Like, for example, the Roman one is all about the goddess. Well, she's not really a goddess, but a kind of entity called Fortuna, who had the power over fate and fortune.
Yeah.
And they all seem to have this same tie-in. The Heart of the Rose, incidentally, the word comes from a medieval poem which refers to the power of Venus. But Venus as a warrior, not as this kind of floaty thing. In the story, she actually has a bow. She's almost like the huntress Diana.
Like Artemis,
Artemis or Diana is the right.
Diana, yeah. Well, the goddess of the animals, Artemis and Diana, were as well. So they would have been connected. I mean, these are all connected with Celtic beliefs. They would have spoken to the spirits. They would have spoken to the animals, possibly, and got help from them and guidance from the animals at that time, from the Celtic civilization. And they certainly would have had holy wells and sacred water, and they would have had healings in those places. So you're tuning in to a very ancient stratum to do with the Neolithic, really, much earlier, and to do with burial chambers, which were like the one in Ireland, that marvelous round stone building.
Oh, Newgrange.
Newgrange, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, there they knew exactly how to bring together the other dimension, the invisible and the visible, in the solar at 25th of December. The solstice, 21st, that we're coming up to next week. They would have known how to build the underground temple in such a way that the sun lit up the chamber, which fertilized the earth, so to speak. All that symbolism would have been part of that Celtic mythology, which was absolutely marvelous, and was part of the Celtic Church until it changed in 621 at the Synod of Whitby, when it became Christian. And you lost all that Celtic input, unfortunately, tragically. So you're doing more than you may realize. You're opening up this layer which has been buried and forgotten for a long time. And these women were obviously doing the same. And they were tuning in probably either to Celtic spirits or to angelic beings, or to people like my mother was St. Francis and another angelic helper. So they knew how to do this, and they got results, evidently. And the results were that they changed the whole political setup.
Did. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, you just read about the different changes that came about for women, not forgetting the vote for women, which happened, from after 1900, but all the changes for women to own property and to have rights and all this sort of thing. A man was allowed to beat his wife quite happily, as long as, you ever heard the story, the rule of thumb? It basically meant, if people say, oh, what's the rule of thumb? It's an old saying. But what it was a man couldn't beat his wife with a stick that was wider than his thumb or her thumb. That was a part of the law in England. And that it became illegal for men to beat their wives. Not that it stopped it happening, but at least it was not legal.
Yeah.
And all these things suddenly changed, and it was men that were changing this. And that's what I think is so amazing, that, I'm thinking, well, they really were able to use this somehow.
Well, the men they were married to must have had great respect for them. They let them get on with whatever they were doing. And possibly they had other pals, as it were, in Parliament they could talk to and say, we really feel that this is something that needs to come into law, because it's high time that women were protected, that sort of thing.
Well, they did have a connection. I mean, it wasn't, Mary Heath's father was a member of Parliament. He was a close friend of as I said, Lord Halifax, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. They did have connections, but I mean, you've still got to persuade a heck of a lot of people. But it wasn't just in this country. It was happening in America. It was happening in Europe. It was happening in all over the world. Anyway, I think
this is why we are all connected. This is a great lesson of our time, is that we know we're not individuals, so to speak, but we're connected in the depths. And it may be through these depths that these things happen, that something gets activated in the depths, which then spreads to all the other countries, as you were saying, which is what needs to happen now. I mean, I see that in the papers yesterday, I think that England is commissioning a whole series of fighter jets now. So even though the schools are falling down, there's not enough food for all the people, they're still willing to spend money on war. And it's that has to stop. It is an addiction. It's always preparing for the future where we might be attacked. Those fighter jets will be shot down by whatever drones would have been developed by then. So
they're not due to come out. They're not due to be made until not due to be serviced
2035,
2034 or 5 or something.
Yeah. It's a ludicrous fantasy which they're tied into, and they can't help not doing it, because then they feel they've failed in the eyes of other men. They've let down the country. They've let down the whole need to protect the country, because they see it in a very natural way as their role is to protect people in their own country, but they don't see themselves as part of the whole of humanity. And that's a tragedy. They don't realize that they're going to kill their brothers and sisters by 2035. And this is not a good idea. If they can only break the idea that they're not connected to each other, and so that it doesn't matter how many people they kill on the other side, so to speak, and if they could see the full horror of what they're planning, it might have some effect, might have some at the deep level, I mean, the unconscious level, because this is where we have to affect the unconscious level if anything is going to change. And to do that, you have to heal, massive heal of all the war wounds that have been inflicted over thousands of years. We've had 4,000 years of patriarchy in which there's been solid war and empire building from the date of Sargon of Akkad, who was about 4000 BC. And from then on, it became first his empire, and then the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian, the Greek, the Roman, the Holy Roman, and onto the modern empires. And this has gone on because men can't stop empire building and having power over each other, defeating each other in war, thereby giving them greater kudos and greater power in the world. But this is a fantasy, complete fantasy. And the spiritual world is horrified by what's going on. And as they said in my mother's messages, I'll just read you one short passage, if I can find it. I put a piece of paper in it here. Only when learn not to shed their brother's blood can the house of God be built on its true foundations. Either you awaken now to spiritual life, or you become diseased and more or less insane. So what we have now is insanity. Wake up to your immortal soul, or it will be taken away from you. For you must know that souls can be taken away from unworthy carriers. Now, those are strong words.
Is your mother actually, is this her words, or is she channeling something? What?
Her friend was channeling. She sat by the friend. The friend was a French woman who knew her for many, many years. And she would sit by the friend, and the friend would write. And then my mother would type up what she had written. Oh. But they did it absolutely together as one, so to speak. And that went on from 1943, when the first extraordinary message came through with an actual physical manifestation of a great being in the flat where they were in New York, who spoke to them and said, follow your hearts and listen to the guidance that is coming through your hearts. And so that's what they did. From then on, they listened to the messages that came through roughly every 3 or 4 months, and they wrote them down. And then I was left these books by my mother when she died. And I suddenly realized this February that really perhaps I could put them into the world. And so I typed them up with a wonderful invention called Dragon on the computer, where you just
that's
speak,
like
and it writes down
an AI thing.
What?
Is it an AI type of thing?
I don't know whether it's an AI thing. It's been going for some time.
Oh, right.
Well, possibly that sort of thing. It doesn't write down anything that you haven't said. It writes down what you're reading out.
Oh, I see. One of those, right.
So you don't have to type it. So it saves hours of typing. I couldn't have done it if I'd had to type it all.
Well, whenever I use those things, it just gets it all wrong, whatever I'm saying.
Well, you try Dragon.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So you've only just published this.
I published them in July.
July.
Mm.
And where did the being or whatever that was communicating this, did it reveal who it or what it was?
Yes, it was Jesus, first of all, who
Jesus.
said that. Yes, because they had known him at the time when he was doing his mission in Palestine. They had been one of the group of women, or two of the group of women around him, of which there were far more than has ever been said, because the whole evidence was repressed. Anything to do with women was wiped out from the record. But there was, I think, 2 circles. There was one circle of women, which I think was 144 women, and a circle of men on the outside, so to speak, interacting with the world, because the women couldn't interact in the world. But the women were speaking to other women and spreading the word through other women at that time. And they were 2 of the women who were doing that. And then they had other incarnations in between, but they never forgot that first incarnation when they had the connection with Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, who was married to Jesus. This has all come out through my own research and the work of another woman who was a close friend. So this has been all completely repressed by the church. It got rid of anything to do with Mary Magdalene, made her into a whore, and deleted any evidence of the fact that she was married and actually had children with Jesus, I think 2 or 3. So all that has been, as it were, deleted from the record. So this really, because I inherited this and knew about these messages from the age of 13, I was aware that there was another dimension of life that we needed to stay in touch with. And that led me in due course to get qualified, to have all the degrees I needed and everything, and start to write at the age of about 70. I'm now 92. I'm quite
really? Oh,
Yeah.
you don't look anything like that. I'm 70 now, and I've been writing for years to start writing. So that's pretty amazing.
Well, anyway, I started writing, and you can look up my website and see what I've done. But all inspired by these messages, because if I hadn't had that deeper ground, I would have married some diplomat or some politician or something. My life would have been wasted on that level. And I never would have discovered what I really am capable of doing and being. So I was immensely grateful to these messages for putting me on the right path. It took me a long time to wake up. And finally I did. And now I'm working as hard as I can to get out the message to men and women that we have to change. But I'm one of thousands on the planet who are doing this. I'm not, by no means alone. There are millions of people now. I would say probably a couple of million out of the 8 billion that we are. That's quite a lot. And if we reach the 10% mark, or I think even the 1% mark, I think that we can swing it. We can change the whole cosmology that we're living under.
Well, one of the reasons that Christianity took off so big before it got established, took over by the Roman Catholic Church and turned into a male-orientated thing with priests and all the rest of it. The early church had been going for, a good couple of hundred years before the. I think the Catholic Church was founded in 320 something.
25.
Constantine, 25. Yeah, the Congress of Nicaea.
Nicaea, that's right.
And so Christianity had been going for 300 years or more by that point. The reason why Christianity became so prevalent throughout the Roman Empire is it appealed to women. Women were invited in. They could play a part in early Christianity, which they couldn't really in any of the other major religions, Mithras and all this. That was all male dominated. And so one of the reasons it became so popular and spread in the first place was because it was appealing to women. Well, you're not going to tell me that if that's how early Christianity was, and we know this from all the early writings from the Romans and Greeks and so on, you're not going to tell me that started off with a guy and a group of 12 other guys and one prostitute, who's the only woman involved. No, there must have been, just as you say, and just as those messages suggested, there was a lot of women associated with Jesus that just got blanked out the record.
There's this book which would fascinate you. It's called Power of the Magdalene. It's a channel. It's a channeled book, and I would advise you to get it because it's just been saying what I've been telling you, that there was a big circle of women around Jesus and Mary Magdalene, as well as a big circle of men. The men weren't too keen on the women, even then. They kept to the men, so to speak, whereas the women formed their own particular group. They didn't mix so much with the men. But they spread, as you say, they spread the word to other women. And it was the first time women could become deacons in the church and even bishops.
They were bishops, women.
They were, yeah. And then there was a dreadful man called Tertullian, who in the 2nd century, I think, who said, oh, these dreadful women. Anyway, he had a whole spiel about how dreadful the women were. And after that, the church began to crush women and cut them out of any ecclesiastical role. And then that culminated in the Council of Nicaea, when Jesus was declared to be the Son of God, because he was of the same substance as God. So there's no, I mean, it may be true in an archetypal sense. I don't sort of deny that, but that's what they deliberately did, so that they would then have a church which could have the power over the masses, so to speak. And the masses would be kept ignorant, except for what they were told to do in church. And that's where the rot set in. The power got into the church, and what Jesus called Caesar took over. Well, so here we are today, still being ruled by that power complex, which is quite unconscious. So people can't be blamed for it. It's deeply, deeply unconscious.
Well, as I was saying, the first leader of the Catholic Church was the emperor, until the emperor wasn't the emperor anymore, and there wasn't an emperor of the West, and ultimately it became the Pope. But that didn't really start. The Bishop of Rome didn't take over the church until about 600, and that was Gregory the Great. So there was a lot of Christianity went through a heck of a lot of changes, but by the time it crystallized into the kind of church we know from the medieval period, women were being, the church was debating whether women actually had souls.
I know. Anyway, all is forgiven because they couldn't do any different because that was the way they thought at that time. There were men who did think differently, but they didn't dare speak up because they would have been killed. So, we're on the path we've been on, but we can change it. And our path has taken us into complete disconnection between the earth, between us and the earth and us and the cosmos, which the ancient Greeks had, and then we lost it afterwards. So we need to get back on track. And I think it sounds as if your book will contribute to that getting back on track.
Well, I'm hoping so.
Yeah, well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Yes, really to hear you both in conversation, hasn't it, Deborah?
Wonderful, absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I have just 30 seconds to come in on just some points that I would like to bring forward? The first one is that I really believe that sitting in this room today is vital. And I think that this podcast and podcasts like this what we need to do to spread through. When I first met Anne, I bought her book. And I knew when I read, is that not showing properly? Yep. I knew when I read it that it was exactly the same tone, vibration as a transmission that we had through Dr. King called the 12 Blessings by the Master Jesus, channeled in 1958. Because of the words and the phrases, I was absolutely convinced that it was from the same source, and it was saying the same things, the building up of the way that we need to move forward. In 1958, we had some transmissions again through Dr. King from some cosmic intelligences saying that women had to step up to the plate and save the world. And do it by their wiles. So they had to convince the men, which is what we've been hearing Anne saying. Convince the men. It's what the ladies did in your group, Graham. They used the divine feminine to convince the men, which then got the laws passed. So this is all fitting in. And the fact that you were ill, Graham, and you couldn't come to the meeting when we originally had it booked. And we're now sitting in this room. We're coming up to the solstice on the 21st, which is a really important day. It's when they used to celebrate bringing the light in from the dark. It's very much linked together.
Can I show you something which I think is a synchronicity? Somewhere here, I don't know where it is, if I can find it. Yeah, there we go. Anne's book has got a rose on the front. It's mine. I thought that was quite interesting.
That's lovely.
Yeah. There's no mistake. There's a very, very clever plan that was put in place when or before Jesus actually walked the earth, and here we are today, taking that message forward, spreading it out. We have to stop the insanity of war. We are all one. We need peace. It starts from inner peace to world peace. And then we can bring in the new world. I think, yeah, I'm probably more than 30 seconds, so I'm going to back out again. Over to you, Jack.
Well, thank you. Thank you both so much. How can people learn more about you? Because I think they both want to get both of your books. So where can people find it?
Well, my website is grahamphillips.net. You can see all the books I've written and everything else there. And you can get my book, which is Strange Fate, on Amazon.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
My books are all on my two websites, one website, which is annebaring.com and anne-baring.com. So there's two websites, but the main one has got my books on it. I've written 8 books altogether, or published 8 books, or co-written or written myself. And also there is the major one, The Dream of the Cosmos, which on that website, it breaks it down into the different chapters and goes into the message in each one.
Thank you. And if people want to learn more about the Aetherius Society, then go to aetherius.org. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.